Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain to you the RACERS paragraph structure. So first I'm going to go over the general structure, then I'm going to give you an example of what that might look like with a particular prompt, and then I'm going to show you a student example and how the RACERS structure fits into an overall essay. So first we have the different components set up here. The R and the A go together. So when we have a prompt, we will restate the prompt, steal some words from it, and answer that prompt all in the very first sentence of a paragraph. When we answer the prompt, we can choose to answer it using these words that we have over here in this little box. This is a really nice, smooth way for you to answer a prompt, and it gives you lots to discuss when we get down to the E and the R, explaining the evidence and then revealing the implicit connections. The R and the A is pretty self-explanatory once we practice it a few times. The C for citing evidence is something that a lot of you already have experience with. Whenever possible in citing evidence, we want to be able to use a direct quote. So if you can use a direct quote, make sure you do that. If you can't and you need to paraphrase or summarize, make sure that you are not adding in any of your own interpretations or opinions, but sticking just to what is in the initial text. Some ways that we can start evidence are with these sentence starters in the gray box. We can say something like, for example, the author states, and then provide our quote, the character says, for instance, or even referencing a page number if it's a text with page number, or a paragraph number. Just sort of introducing that quote and not just jumping into a quote immediately. So that can be some ways that we can improve our evidence. Now, the harder parts come with the E and the R in our RACERS paragraph structure. The E, we're still going to keep it fairly simple. You're explaining the explicit evidence. So whatever you just quoted, you're just going to tell me about it. What do they really mean? Explain it to us, summarize it again, provide context, tell me when it happens in the story or what's going on in the story or who is saying that particular quote. Just give me some basic evidence or some basic explanation for that evidence. The R is where it gets really, really tricky now. So we're still kind of talking about the evidence, but we're now connecting it to the larger picture. We're linking it back up to whatever your answer was in your first sentence, maybe explaining how those things connect. Maybe you're talking about author strategies. Maybe you're discussing that ELA term that you use to answer the question. Maybe you're just explaining that a little bit more. Maybe you're connecting it to the real world. This can go in so many different directions. And because this is the place where analysis happens in that R, so this is like a really, really important part of our essay, we want to make sure that we actually do more than one thing. So in terms of how many sentences we have, the R and the A together will be one sentence. Citing evidence is going to be one, maybe two, if the evidence is long. The explanation of the evidence could really be anywhere from 2 to 4 sentences. But the revealing the implicit connections and the logic that you're thinking of, this is really going to be more like 3 to even as many as like 7 sentences. This is going to be really long, and then summing it up is just going to be 1. Okay, so let's take a look at what this means if we're discussing an actual prompt here. So up at the top now, I have a prompt listed here for you. It says, how does the setting impact the story? So this is a general prompt that could be used with any number of texts. How does the setting impact the story? So in our first sentence, the R and the A, we want to, remember, include both the R and the A in the one sentence. So restating the prompt, I'm going to steal words from the prompt. That's what that means. So I might say the setting impacts the story. That's how I'll begin it, and then I'm going to answer it. So one way a setting can impact a story is maybe by creating conflict. So particularly if the setting, is dangerous in some way or allows somebody to hide behind corners, that could create the conflict. So we could answer this by saying, the setting impacts the story by creating conflict. So that would be it. My R and my A are already done in this example. Check, check. Then for citing evidence, again, we want to use a quote wherever possible. I could say, you know, for example, in the text, the setting is described as. So I'm really kind of leading into and introducing this quote before I introduce it. Now for the E, explaining the explicit evidence, I'm just going to talk about, you know, some more details with the setting. So if I say that the setting's very dark, maybe I just explain how it's at night, that the building is very large, and so you can't see very well inside this building. And maybe I even say, you know, this is important because the character goes from being, you know, outside during the daytime to all of a sudden in the building, and, you know, the sun is setting, so it's nighttime, so it's getting darker and darker. So I'm kind of explaining it in the context of the story. Still pretty basic and simple. The R is where it gets much, much more complicated. So in this R, for this particular prompt, I could perhaps explain why setting causes conflict. I could explain what conflict is to begin with. You know, explaining what those ELA terms is an option for you, certainly. I could explain how this evidence specifically makes the readers feel anxious and makes us feel nervous, and how that leads to conflict. But I want to make sure that I'm not just repeating whatever I stated. So I'm not just repeating the evidence. I'm not just saying it's dark out. I'm explaining why does it being dark lead to more conflict. So that's really important here, is you're constantly explaining why or how with that R. And then finally, we've got the S, summing it up. For the sum it up S, you're probably going to say whatever you said in your initial answer, but you're going to rephrase it. So instead of saying the setting impacts the story by creating conflict, I could say, you know, in conclusion, this shows that having a dark and mysterious setting can lead to conflict. So very similar kind of phrasing, but I'm just mixing up the words a little bit. Okay, let's take a look at what this looks like now in an actual essay. So we've got an essay here that was written by a former student of mine. And what we're going to see here is that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. This first paragraph is an intro. So it does not abide by the RACERS structure fully. The final paragraph is a conclusion, so it does not abide by the RACERS structure. But these two here in the middle are going to be our RACERS style paragraphs. Now, if we take a look here, we're going to go through and just highlight the different parts. So one thing that's really cool that happens within an essay to provide some structure and some organization is the last sentence of the entire intro paragraph. So that last sentence of the intro paragraph is what we're going to call a thesis statement. And the thesis statement basically organizes the R and the A. So here, the prompt was, and I'm looking at the prompt right up here, the prompt says, what is the significance of David's letters in the story? This sentence answers that question. The significance of these letters, so stealing from that prompt, is that they display conflict and relationships in the story. There are actually 2 answers here. So in this thesis statement, we have 2 answers, and what we'll see is the body paragraphs each address one of those answers. So here's our R and A for the first body paragraph. The letters are important because they show conflict. We see that connection here, conflict here, conflict here. The next body paragraph says also the letters display the importance of relationships. So now we're tying it back to the relationships. We see that component there. The evidence here is going to be pretty easy to find as well. We will see those sentence starters, and then direct quotes will help us. So in the text, another robot tells David to go downstairs and give it to her, meaning the letter. David responds by saying it isn't quite right. She won't understand. So these are the parts just where we're talking about the evidence itself. Then for the next part, that explaining the explicit evidence, we're just talking about that evidence. So here's an example here. This piece of evidence shows conflict because David is scared to give his letter to his mom, thinking that she won't understand his emotions. And down at this next one, it says, this piece of dialogue shows a bad relationship because if they had a good relationship, he would have sent the letter even if it wasn't perfect. Instead, he kept rewriting the letters until it was just what he wanted, but that never happened. So we see that they're still kind of talking about those letters, talking about that evidence. Then we're going to get into more of the analysis, and there is definitely a blurred line between the E and the R. But when we start talking about bigger things going beyond just the direct quote, that's when we're beginning to talk about analysis and that revealing the implicit. So here in this sentence, the student says, in a story, there are usually 3 possible types of conflict. They're no longer talking about just the evidence now. They're talking about that ELA term for conflict. So this is where now we are beginning to see a lot more of the analysis taking place. So as we can see here now, we've got those different components, but we don't have, I'll change our color here. We don't have our S for sum it up. A lot of times in an essay, this doesn't necessarily happen at the end of every RACERS paragraph. Instead, we'll see that happening more so just in our concluding paragraph, which then again will oftentimes come back and address whatever that initial R and A is for our entire essay. Okay, hopefully that this helped you guys understand not only the RACERS paragraph structure and how we can complete some of those individual components, but also how that structure would fit into a larger essay. As always, if you have any questions, make sure you reach out and let me